in 1977, the federal government issued formal advice. Fat was bad for you, carbohydrate was good for you, switch. And if you look at the patterns of eating in this country, it's all explained, as you say, in the book, you can see that people actually did as they were told. People stopped eating fat and started eating carbohydrate. And by some extraordinary coincidence, the obesity epidemic takes off in 1980.
Yeah.
It takes about 3 years for people to start putting on the pounds, and then they've been putting on the pounds ever since. It's a tragic tale. It came out a very interesting story. There was a genuine problem, not just in America, but throughout the Western world, in the 50s and 60s, a terrible epidemic of heart attacks. Middle-aged men, it was mainly men, middle-aged men were just dropping down dead at the height of their apparent strength. Even Eisenhower had a heart attack. And suddenly everyone became aware that an astonishing proportion of deaths, something like 1/3 of all deaths, were due to heart attacks. And this apparently had come from nowhere. In the 19th century, doctors didn't talk about heart attacks because there didn't seem to be heart attacks in the 19th century. It really was a new disease, and everyone was absolutely petrified. Who was going to die next? It was a genuine public health emergency. So let's not pretend it wasn't. It was a genuine public health emergency. But what happened was a man called Ancel Keyes, now dead, professor of physiology in Minnesota. He came along, and just as Greta Thunberg is Time Person of the Year, so on the front of Time magazine, so we find Ancel Keyes on the cover of Time magazine, although I don't think he was ever Person of the Year, claiming he knew how to solve the heart attack problem. Because if you look at someone's blood vessels who've died of a heart attack, the blood vessel's full of fat. Therefore, it seemed very obvious to Ancel Keyes that you just had to eat less fat and you wouldn't get atherosclerosis. It was a stunningly naive and simplistic model that even at the time people denied. The trouble was that it entered into the field of politics because, of course, politicians were dying of heart attacks like everyone else. And politicians...
So suddenly it was real.
Suddenly it was real. Yeah. And politicians wanted to seize on a story that they could then sell to the American public as representing themselves as the saviors of the American public. Vote for me, I will save you from having a heart attack. And so they seized on a story that was utterly premature. What Ancel Keyes did is exactly as I described earlier. He was, and by the way, the two great authors here are Nina Teicholz, I never know how you pronounce her name, an American journalist who wrote a great book called Big Fat Surprise, and Gary Taubes, who wrote a similar book earlier called Good Calories, Bad Calories. These are the two great authors in this field, and they did a lot of uncovering of what was going on. But what Ancel Keyes did, he essentially bullied. It's a really shocking story of just how one man with utter certainty and a very strong character can basically bully first his peers, and then their subordinates, and then the journals, and you get into a situation where it becomes self-referential. People don't want to upset Ancel because he's a monster, so they go along with what he says, and then other people go along with what they say, and before you know where you are, you have an entire scientific community subscribing, because the science is settled, to a completely false hypothesis. He was just wrong. But no one dared, for about 40 years, point out that he was wrong. No one dared point out that the emperor had no clothes.